Imagine losing the love of your life, your partner of over 40 years. Imagine the grief, the silence, the emptiness that follows you through every room of your home. Now imagine that, just weeks later, instead of sympathy from your community, you get a letter in the mail, not a letter of condolence. Not a neighbor checking in, but a demand: sell your home. You can't keep up with appearances anymore. That's exactly what happened to Margaret Johnson, a 72-year-old widow who had lived in her quiet suburban neighborhood for more than 3 decades. For Margaret, her home wasn't just a building, it was a living scrapbook. Every corner held a memory. The kitchen where she and her late husband, Tom, cooked Sunday breakfasts. The garden he planted with their grandkids. The porch swing where they sat every summer evening. It was more than a house, it was her heart. Tom had passed away suddenly after a heart attack. The loss hit Margaret like a freight train. For weeks, she barely slept. She moved through the house in silence, clutching Tom's old flannel shirt just to feel close to him. Friends stopped by with casseroles. Her church group checked in, but the grief was unbearable. Margaret was still adjusting to this new, painful reality when the HOA decided to strike. The neighborhood's HOA, led by its president Barbara Miller, a woman known for her sharp tongue and obsession with rules, sent a formal notice. The letter claimed that single homeowners like Margaret often struggled to maintain property standards, and that, in the HOA's opinion, she should consider selling her home to a younger family who could keep up appearances. When Margaret read the letter, she thought it had to be some kind of cruel mistake. She sat at her kitchen table, tears in her eyes, reading it over and over again. Sell her home, because she was alone now. Barbara wasn't done. Just days later, Margaret received her first violation notice. The grass in her front yard, which Tom had always mowed, had grown slightly longer than usual. Normally, Margaret would have handled it, or Tom would have taken care of it. But in the middle of her grief, it had slipped her mind. The HOA slapped her with a $100 fine. Margaret tried to explain. She called Barbara and told her she was grieving, that she just needed a little time. Barbara's response was chilling. Rules don't stop for personal problems. If you can't keep up, maybe this neighborhood isn't for you anymore. Those words crushed Margaret. She wasn't just losing her husband. Now she was being pushed out of the home they had built together. At first, Margaret tried to comply. She hired a local teenager to mow the lawn. She pulled weeds when her back allowed. But Barbara and her HOA board seemed to be watching her like hawks. If a trash can sat out for more than a few hours, she got a notice. If a flower bed looked overgrown, she got another fine. It felt less like enforcement and more like harassment. Neighbors started to notice and whispered about how heartless the HOA was being, but most were afraid to speak up. Barbara had a reputation for going after anyone who crossed her, and few wanted to be her next target. One neighbor, however, couldn't stay silent. A man named George, a Vietnam veteran who had lived across the street for decades, started helping Margaret with her yard. He trimmed hedges, watered plants, even repainted her fence one weekend. But when Barbara saw George working, she stormed over and snapped, "If she can't do it herself, she shouldn't be here. We can't have outsiders doing the work for her." That was the moment Margaret realized this wasn't about grass, or flower beds or rules. This was about control. Barbara didn't want her there, she wanted her gone. Margaret's daughter, Emily, urged her to fight back. "Mom, you don't have to take this. Dad built this home for us. You have every right to stay." But Margaret, frail and still grieving, felt overwhelmed. Fighting the HOA seemed impossible. What Margaret didn't know was that this cruel campaign against her would soon explode into a battle that stretched far beyond her neighborhood. A battle that would shine a spotlight on Barbara, on the HOA, and on what happens when power is abused in the cruelest way possible. Because Margaret wasn't just a widow, she was about to become a symbol of resilience, of justice, and of what happens when communities decide enough is enough. Margaret thought maybe, just maybe, things would calm down if she quietly complied with the HOA's demands. She hired help when she could afford it, kept her trash bins tucked away, and even forced herself to trim the bushes despite her aching back. But Barbara and her board weren't satisfied. If anything, her compliance seemed to encourage them. It was as if they smelled blood in the water. 2 weeks later, Margaret opened her mailbox and found another thick envelope from the HOA. Inside were 3 separate violation notices. One for grass length exceeding regulation, another for visible weeds in flower beds, and a third claiming paint chipping on front steps. Each carried a fine. In total, she owed nearly $500. For Margaret, that wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was devastating. She lived on a fixed income, her late husband's pension, and a modest Social Security check. That money barely covered utilities, groceries, and medication. Paying $500 to an HOA because of a few weeds. That was unthinkable. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, bills spread out, tears welling in her eyes. She whispered to herself, "Tom, what am I going to do? You always handled this." It wasn't just about the money, it was about the weight of it all. The crushing sense that she was being forced out of her own home. Her daughter Emily came by that evening. When she saw the letters, her face flushed red with anger. "This is harassment, Mom, plain and simple. They're trying to bully you out." Margaret tried to stay calm. I don't want trouble. I can't handle a fight right now. But Emily wasn't having it. This isn't about trouble. This is about them taking advantage of you when you're at your weakest. Dad wouldn't stand for this, and neither should we. The next day, Emily marched into the HOA office with the letters in hand. Barbara sat behind a polished oak desk, smug as ever. When Emily confronted her, Barbara leaned back in her chair and said coldly, "Your mother can't maintain the property. This community has standards. It's better for everyone if she moves on." Emily's voice shook with rage. Better for everyone, or better for you? My parents have been here for over 30 years. They've paid every fee, followed every rule, built this neighborhood with their own hands. And now you want to push my mother out because she's grieving. Barbara didn't flinch. We all have responsibilities. If she can't keep up, she doesn't belong here. Emily left shaking with fury, but she also left with determination. If Barbara thought Margaret was alone, she was about to learn otherwise. Emily began documenting everything. Every notice, every fine, every harsh remark. She spoke to George, the Vietnam veteran across the street, who eagerly agreed to testify about Barbara's cruelty. Slowly, Emily started building a case. Meanwhile, Margaret tried to hold herself together. Nights were the hardest. She would sit in Tom's old recliner, clutching his photo, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. "They want me gone, Tom," she whispered. "But this is our home, our story. How can I leave it?" Then came the breaking point. One morning, Margaret woke to the sound of pounding on her door. It was a contractor hired by the HOA without her permission to inspect her front steps for safety violations. They claimed that chipped paint posed a community hazard. Margaret felt humiliated. Her home wasn't just being scrutinized, it was being invaded. When Emily heard about this, she lost it. "That's it, they've crossed the line. They can't just barge onto your property like that. We're going to fight back, Mom. I don't care how long it takes." But Barbara wasn't done escalating. That week, the HOA board sent a letter recommending forced compliance. It stated that if Margaret failed to meet community standards within 30 days, the HOA would pursue legal action, including possible foreclosure. Yes, foreclosure. Margaret felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. Losing Tom was unbearable enough. But losing their home, the place where every memory lived, that was unthinkable. She collapsed into Emily's arms, sobbing, "They're going to take everything your father and I built." But Emily refused to let her mother give up. She reminded her of who Tom was, a hard-working man who had served his country, raised a family, and always stood tall in the face of adversity. Dad was a fighter, Mom, and so are you. They don't get to erase his legacy because some power-hungry woman wants you gone. With Emily's fire and George's support, Margaret began to feel a spark of strength return. She agreed to let Emily reach out to a lawyer who specialized in HOA abuse. The lawyer, after hearing the story, shook his head in disbelief. "This isn't enforcement. This is targeted harassment. And trust me, judges don't look kindly on HOAs that cross the line." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She had her daughter, her neighbor, and now the law on her side. But Barbara wasn't the type to back down quietly. She doubled down, preparing her board for a legal battle, convinced she could crush Margaret with the HOA's deep pockets. What she didn't realize was that her cruelty had awakened something powerful. A community that was about to rise up, rallying behind a grieving widow who refused to be broken. And the stage was set for a showdown that would not only decide Margaret's future, but expose the ugly truth about Barbara and the HOA to the world. The day of the hearing arrived, and Margaret barely recognized herself in the mirror. Instead of the weary widow who had been beaten down by notices, fines, and threats, she saw someone standing straighter, steadier. Her daughter Emily clasped her hand tightly, whispering, "Dad would be proud of you today." At the courthouse, Barbara swept in with her polished heels and an entourage of board members, carrying thick folders like weapons. She smirked when she saw Margaret, as if victory were already hers. "This won't take long," Barbara muttered under her breath, loud enough for Margaret to hear. But Margaret, for the first time, didn't shrink. She lifted her chin. "We'll see." The courtroom filled with neighbors. George, the Vietnam veteran, sat in the front row, his cane resting against his leg, his sharp eyes locked on Barbara. Behind him, other community members, many who had quietly endured Barbara's reign of intimidation, showed up in silent solidarity. For Margaret, their presence was like armor. When the judge entered, the room settled. The case was called. The HOA versus Margaret Johnson. Barbara's lawyer began with a rehearsed speech, painting Margaret as negligent, irresponsible, and a threat to the community's property values. He laid out the fines, the weeds, the chipped paint, the supposed violations, every word dripping with arrogance. Barbara nodded along, her lips curled into a satisfied grin. Then Emily's lawyer stood. "Calm but firm," he began. "Your Honor, this is not a case about community standards. This is a case about harassment. A grieving widow, who has lived in her home for over 3 decades, has been systematically targeted by an HOA president who has abused her authority." He presented photos of Margaret's yard, not pristine, but hardly the jungle the HOA claimed. He showed the receipts of fines that far exceeded reason. Then, He called witnesses. George rose slowly, every step heavy but deliberate. When he took the stand, the courtroom leaned in. His voice, gravelly but steady, carried weight. "I fought for this country," he said. "I watched friends die overseas so people like us could come home and live in peace. And now I watch this woman, a widow, a neighbor, a friend, being torn apart because she can't mow her lawn fast enough while grieving her husband. This isn't about rules, this is about cruelty." The room fell silent, even the judge's expression softened. George continued, his gaze fixed on Barbara. "What she's doing is wrong. And if we let people like her hide behind bylaws and technicalities, then shame on all of us." Next came Emily, who spoke not just as Margaret's daughter, but as a witness to the torment. "I've seen my mother cry herself to sleep, terrified she'll lose the home she'll built with my father. This house isn't just walls and grass. It's the place where my dad carried me on his shoulders, where we celebrated birthdays, where my parents held hands every evening on the porch, and they want to take it away because of weeds, because of paint." Her voice broke, but she didn't back down. "This isn't about community, this is bullying." Barbara fidgeted in her seat. For the first time, her smirk faltered. Then came Margaret's turn. She hadn't planned to speak, but when the judge asked if she wanted to say anything, she stood. Her voice trembled at first but grew steadier with each word. "When my husband Tom was alive, he always said this community was special. We worked hard to keep our home beautiful, not because we feared fines, but because we loved where we lived. Losing him broke me, and while I was trying to pick up the pieces, instead of compassion, I was met with threats." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for fairness, for humanity. Because if a woman can't grieve her husband without being dragged here, then what kind of community do we really have?" By the time she finished, the room was heavy with emotion. Even those who had remained neutral shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Barbara with thinly veiled disapproval. The judge leaned forward. "I've heard enough." He looked directly at Barbara. "Homeowners associations are meant to protect neighborhoods, not terrorize residents. What I see here is not enforcement of standards but an abuse of power." He ruled immediately. The fines were voided, the violations dismissed, and the HOA was ordered to cease its harassment. On top of that, Barbara's board was reprimanded, with the judge warning that continued misconduct could result in serious legal penalties. Barbara's face went pale. For once, she had no words. The board members who had followed her so loyally now avoided her eyes, shifting uncomfortably as whispers rippled through the crowd. Margaret exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She turned to Emily, who hugged her tightly. "You did it, Mom. We did it." George gave a small nod, his weathered face breaking into a proud smile. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had stayed silent out of fear now began to speak openly. Stories emerged of Barbara's intimidation, her unfair fines, her ruthless tactics. Within weeks, a petition circulated calling for her removal. And this time, the majority stood together. Barbara fought to the bitter end, but the tide had turned. She was voted out, humiliated, her grip on power broken. And for the first time in years, the community felt lighter, freer. Margaret didn't gloat. She simply sat on her porch one evening, Emily by her side, George across the street, and whispered to the wind, "We did it, Tom, we're still home." The ramp, the chipped paint, the weeds, they were never the real issue. The real battle was for dignity, compassion, and the right to grow old in peace. And in the end, Margaret won more than just her home. She reclaimed her voice, and in doing so, reminded everyone what it truly meant to be a neighbor.